Hello again. Racism, like fascism, is a popular buzzword in the modern world. Describing somebody as a racist is an easy and costly way of attacking anybody one dislikes, and the consequences of such a denunciation can be very satisfying because it is an accusation almost impossible to counter. Some of the mud is sure to stick. The reason that it's so hard to counter an accusation of racism is because there are so many different definitions of the word that nobody is ever quite sure which one is being used. Let's look at a few of these and see what is meant by them. Perhaps if we start with one or two of the more traditional ideas of racism, and we'll see what we can make of them. A very old and traditional definition of racism is prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against someone of a different race based on such a belief. Right. This kind of thing used to be pretty common at one time in Britain, but it's not quite so frequently seen these days. Discrimination against people in housing and education and so on, and employment is not a big thing now. The idea of discriminating against somebody on the grounds of skin colour alone is awful to most of us, and denying somebody a place at university or refusing a person a job or home because he or she is Jewish or black is not something which many of us would support or feel comfortable about. In the same way, hatred or dislike of somebody prompted merely by skin colour or ethnicity is an odious idea, and I think that most people would agree that such a thing is irrational and undesirable. There is, of course, a more modern idea of what constitutes racism, and this is that racism is a systematic oppression of a racial group to the social, economic, and political advantage of another. This concept is taken from critical race theory and means that racism cannot be exhibited by any minority in Britain today, that it's something only white people can engage in. This is because it's white people who hold the levers of power and are in position to instigate systemic oppression. It's sometimes known as institutional racism. The problem with that definition of racism is that it means automatically that a black man who despises Pakistanis and Indians cannot be guilty of racism because he doesn't have the power in society. Unless you buy into critical race theory, this particular definition will perhaps be seen as unsatisfactory. Another common definition is that racism is the belief that all members of each race possess characteristics, abilities, or qualities specific to that race, especially so as to distinguish it as inferior or superior to another race. This is more interesting in that different ethnic groups might well have different strengths and weaknesses. Intelligence is one possibility, although this would be a matter of percentages rather than absolutes. It is possible, by no means certain, that people of East Asian heritage, say, tend to have slightly higher levels of intelligence on average than white Europeans. This would only show up, though, if you took very large numbers of people and compared those populations together. It wouldn't mean that a Chinese person, of course, was inevitably more clever than a white person. It would show only at the extremes of high or low intelligence. This sort of thing is possible, but it wouldn't really make one group superior to another. A lot of people are more intelligent than me, but I don't regard them as being superior to me. Intelligence is just one particular human characteristic and not even the most important one. Do very clever people feel superior to me? Would a Chinese person meeting me assume at once that he was more clever than me and feel that I was inferior as a result? It seems unlikely. For my own part, I have never denied being a racist, but nor have I claimed to be one. If anybody wishes to assume that I'm racist, that's fine, but I don't necessarily agree. Whenever the topic comes up, I always try to find out which particular definition the person making the suggestion is using, but this is treated as a cunning piece of sophistry. Sensible folk can apparently identify things like racism and fascism without worrying about having any coherent idea of what they mean by the terms. The intellectual revolution of the Enlightenment has passed such people by, and they feel able to engage in discourse without knowing what they mean by the words which they use. Some of us think this is a recipe for disaster, and that such an approach renders sensible conversation and rational debate impossible.